Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to take your seats as we begin our second panel of the day. To say that our world is in flux would imply that there was once a time and place where it was not. In his book, Leadership, former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor and Nixon Foundation Director Emeritus, Dr. Henry Kissinger wrote, "Then, as now, an important school of thought maintained that stability and peace were the normal state of international affairs, while conflict was the consequence of either misunderstanding or malevolence. Nixon's perception was more dynamic. He viewed peace as a state of fragile and fluid equilibrium among the great powers, a precarious balance that in turn constituted a vital component of international stability. The rise of the People's Republic of China, the 20-year dissolution of democracy in Russia, new challenges in Africa, throughout the South Pacific, and especially now in the Middle East, are contributing to an era of, well, flux." To begin this program, please welcome Leland Vittert, host of On Balance with Leland Vittert on News Nation, who will moderate the discussion and introduce our panel participants.
Good morning. All right, this is actually working. Thank you. There wasn't too loud an applause, so I don't have to say to wait until you hear what I say. Panelists with us this morning, and thank you. Hold your applause until we get through everybody. Bonnie Glasser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Shigure Kitamaro, former Secretary General of National Security Secretariat of Japan. Matt Pottinger, former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor, and John Sitilides, Principal at Trilogy Advisors, Senior Fellow, National Security Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you very much all to be joining us. And obviously, since we put this panel together, things have changed a little bit in the world. When we all talked a week ago Friday, we thought we were going to begin with China and the changes that we were seeing out of China. Obviously, world events have intervened. 50 years ago, almost to the day, was the Yom Kippur War. And while history does not necessarily repeat itself, it does sometimes rhyme, as Twain said. And the attack on Israel by Hamas brings us back to that time. And some of the events we've seen since then remind us of Yom Kippur. President Nixon was famously credited with both saving Israel and his clear-minded foreign policy is also credited with preventing it from spreading into a larger war. And he was interviewed about that and his thoughts about how he stared down the Soviets as it related to the Middle East after his presidency. We'll take a listen to that.
There were 85 Soviet ships in the Mediterranean. That on those ships, among other things, were helicopters and landing barges, and that 3 Soviet airborne divisions, 50,000 men, had been placed on alert. But we could not allow the Soviet Union to intervene unilaterally there, because if they had, we would have been forced to intervene. I know that Senator Mansfield had told us earlier in the month, right after the war, he said, we don't want another Vietnam there. But another member of Congress, who was in the majority on the Democratic side, made it very clear to in contrast. He said, we want to be sure that Israel continues to have support. And I said, I will not let Israel go down the tube. And I knew that under the circumstances, we could not stand by and let the Soviet Union move in. And that would risk a world war. So under the circumstances, therefore, I approved an alert of our forces, nuclear and conventional. A couple of days after that, Brezhnev backed down, and finally the ceasefire went into place. This is all by now the 26th of October, only 20 days after the Yom Kippur War began. November 1st, the tide had changed by that time. The ceasefire was in place. Golda Meir, shortly after that, flew into Washington, thanked me very generously for the support we had given. And November the 7th, after a time of elapsing of 6 years, Egypt and the United States normalized their relations, and Henry Kissinger started on his very successful shuttle trip. Summarizing it all, I think it's very important to note here two things. One, this is not a demonstration of détente failing but succeeding. Unless I'd had the personal relationship with Brezhnev, unless he knew from what I had said to him at Camp David that we would not stand by unless I had developed that kind of relation, and unless he was looking forward to another summit the next year, I do not think that we would have been successful in keeping them out. That helped. The second point is that we handled the whole situation in a way that saved Israel, but at the same time did not totally alienate the Egyptians, because the Israelis, by the time the ceasefire occurred, had all totally surrounded the Egyptian Third Army, which was on the other side of the Suez Canal. So they held back, and the Egyptians were appreciative of that. And so as a result, this was one of those wars which ended with peace without victory. And peace without victory is virtually the only kind of peace you can have that will survive in that kind of a situation. You can have too great a victory. If it is too great, what happens is you plant the seeds for another war.
And it lasted for 50 years, if you want to say there was peace in the Middle East. Matt, we've seen some moves by the Russians now that mimic what the Soviets did 50 years ago. Vladimir Putin has now moved his hypersonic missiles and deployed them now to the Mediterranean, conceivably where they could take on the U.S. Navy there. What do you make of President Biden's military moves, diplomatic moves, his trip there to Israel, and what do you expect him to say tonight?
Well, look, I give President Biden credit for making the trip to Israel. I give him credit for sending not one but two carrier strike groups. I think the Biden administration's response in Israel, as in Ukraine, is better after the war starts than in terms of deterring war in the first place. And there's a lesson in that with respect to Taiwan. I've seen some reporting. I think Reuters had a very interesting report citing unnamed Israeli officials about some of the tactics that Hamas was using to try to lull Israel into a sense of complacency. And they were intentionally feeding disinformation into the intelligence stream in Israel. And the intelligence that they were feeding were two things: senior Hamas leaders, other things, saying we don't intend to take on Israel anytime soon. We're not capable of taking on Israel anytime soon. And then we saw what happened, the tragedy of this massive terrorist assault less than 2 weeks ago. So there's a lesson in that. We can't be overly confident that we understand all the signals coming out of Beijing. Beijing is a master of deception. They wrote the book, quite literally, a couple thousand years ago. So, but I don't know what he's going to talk about specifically tonight. But I do give him credit for sending those strike groups.
Mr. Kitamura, I thought it was interesting. The largest rally I saw for Israel was in Tokyo, and the pictures from downtown Tokyo of people waving Israeli flags was a massive, massive crowd. Maybe that didn't surprise you. It awfully surprised me, even as somebody who has studied the Middle East. What did that tell you?
I think in Japan, the right of the expression and the demonstration is totally guaranteed. And I think it's a very natural reaction of the Israeli who stay in Tokyo. I'm not specialist in this region, but I have some observation on this issue. In mid-September, the US government lifted $6 billion in frozen Iranian funds in exchange for releasing 5 US hostages. And 8 days before the October 7th, the Hamas attacks, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said, the situation in the Middle East is the most stable in the past 20 years, and since 9/11. These phenomena mean two things. First, security policymakers were not aware of the attacks until shortly before they occurred. In other words, it's an intelligence failure. Second, it indicates that the US is not exercising appropriate policy in the long term toward Iran, which is a strong ally in the act of terrorism. I'm actually raise my favorite quote from President Nixon. If you take no risks, you will suffer no defeats. But if you take no risks, you will know victories. This phrase is going with my way of life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I think certainly that proves apt right now. Bonnie, I'm glad Matt brought up sort of the way China has acted in perhaps we don't quite understand fully their way of thinking. Matt pointed out they literally wrote the book. I think you're referring to Art of War. When I was in Israel, it was famous that the Israelis, when they would want to have a conversation in front of you and have you not understand it, they would speak in Hebrew. And they did this about very classified information. You could be with their military or their diplomats or Netanyahu or whatever, and he would speak freely in Hebrew to his advisors or his friends, and you'd have no idea what they were saying, obviously. Interestingly enough, there's a story where a Chinese delegation came to look at some weapon systems, and the Israelis would freely talk in Hebrew in front of the Chinese delegation about the capabilities and what they could and couldn't tell the Chinese, and they compared their weapon systems to the Chinese weapon systems, on and on and on, and shared some very highly classified information between the Israelis in Hebrew. And at the end of their trip, 4 or 5 days, the senior Chinese general said in perfect Hebrew, "Thank you very much. We are so glad to have come here to Israel and to have seen all of your weapon systems. Thank you. Have a nice day. We look forward to welcoming you to Beijing." The Israelis were obviously stunned, but it goes to, I think, what Matt was talking about, which is the lack of understanding in America about how China is playing the game. Fair?
Well, I think anybody who's been following China's approach to the world, and certainly we can look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and in February 2022, but even before that, the very long joint communique that Putin signed with Xi Jinping. And you can't help but conclude that China is looking at the world through the prism of its competition with the United States and wants to undermine U.S. global influence. And I think that in part explains its response to Ukraine, and it certainly explains its response to Hamas's attack on Israel. The Chinese, for a long time, have taken a position of trying to have good relations with both sides. They obviously have diplomatic relations with Palestine, and they have had a very important relationship with Israel, which, of course, your story underscores how important the technology and defense technology relationship was in the past. And so it really, I think, shouldn't surprise anybody that the Chinese came out with a statement of calling for an end of hostilities, supporting a two-state solution. I think there are many in Israel who are disappointed. So the Chinese have said there should be no civilians who are killed, but they're not pointing fingers. And as far as I can tell, there has not been a single statement out of China yet that has even mentioned Hamas.
Or called for the return of hostages or any of these issues.
No mention of hostage release. So, the Chinese say that they, at some point, would like to send their special envoy, but they're not going to be a mediator of this conflict. They neither have the hard power or the soft power in the Middle East, I believe, to have a really significant impact on the outcome.
No, but they certainly, I think to your point, though, would have a desire to try and undermine whatever U.S. work is done and U.S. influence there.
That's the goal.
John, great power competition, a world in flux, and to pick up where Bonnie left off, that how much is it enough for China to just play spoiler to U.S. influence, whether it be playing spoiler as it relates to Ukraine and NATO, playing spoiler as it relates to the Middle East, playing spoiler, and this is a little bit more directed towards them, as it relates to, say, the South China Sea?
I think it depends on the situation. I don't think that Beijing is necessarily, I mean, when I say Beijing, I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party, right? We need to be clear that everything we say and do regarding our relations with China must pass through the filter of this rigid Leninist ideology that dominates the government or controls the government in Beijing. I would imagine it's not necessarily zero-sum in every instance, Leland, that where China can benefit from some measure of cooperation or an affinity of interests, it might pursue it. Unfortunately, I don't know that we're clear yet in the Middle East what that situation will look like or how it plays out in the weeks and months ahead. And if I might, I want to just pull back a second to the Middle East itself, because from a grand strategy perspective, the U.S. is dealing with a number of major objectives or priorities it needs to sort out. One, first of all, what is going to be the role of the Arab governments, the Sunni Arab governments in the Middle East regarding the future of the Palestinian people? They've had largely the luxury of sitting this out, or in the case of, say, Qatar, funding Hamas and destabilizing the situation in the Middle East. But to what extent, perhaps, say, when this war is over, or at least this initial phase of the war, would Arab governments volunteer their militaries to serve as a peacekeeping force in Gaza to replace whatever the Israeli Defense Forces leave of it when this is over? What do we do about the Shia theocracy in Tehran that is sponsoring terrorism around the world, including here in the United States, that still has bounties on former American officials, including some of your former colleagues, Matt, and is seeking to actively destabilize the Middle East, but is also now a major provider of oil under long-term contracts to China, as is Saudi Arabia. We have the issue of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, and I think to one extent, perhaps, I can't read anyone's mind, one of the reasons that Iran may have greenlit the Hamas attack on Israel is not just to deflect the progress that was being made on the Abraham Accords with possible Saudi participation, but specifically to make sure that the component of that deal that would allow for the U.S. to support a nuclear weapons program in Saudi Arabia would be derailed, and Iran remains the only other nuclear power in the Middle East so as to achieve its regional hegemonic aspirations vis-a-vis Israel. And I would just conclude on this. One, first of all, Russia and China are going to be major diplomatic players now. It's a very changed world, ladies and gentlemen, and we have to contend somehow, and I guess this is part of the larger grand strategy theme here, the America of the Cold War is behind us. That ended in 1991. And I think dealing with the communist threat on a global scale galvanized a measure of American solidarity that we simply don't have today. As you heard from the prior panelists, we have a decomposition of American solidarity, a cohesiveness in this country that is sorely lacking, and I think that's going to weaken us on the global stage. But I would say, given China's ability to bring about a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran back in March, while all this has been going on the last couple of weeks, we missed the fact that China welcomed Bashar Assad to Beijing, as well as the Crown Prince of Kuwait, and so making major diplomatic inroads in an area that maybe is somewhat rethinking whether or not America is a credible ally of the Sunni governments in the region. And I'll just close again with one reference to the earlier panel, Leland, and that is the degree to which the Middle East is an extremely important part of the world because our Asian allies and our European allies are so heavily dependent on the Middle East for oil and natural gas. And the degree to which they can be weaned from that dependence more towards, again, as the earlier panelist said, U.S. and other friendly, let's call it near-shoring or near-sourcing of hydrocarbons as we move through the transition of the decades ahead, and a more pronounced dependence on nuclear energy, so that what happens in the Middle East is less important over the long term to our critical allies in Asia and Europe. And I think all of these components have to be part of a larger grand strategy, and then we'll dig more deeply into China and Russia as well.
lot there. I'm thinking about what you said in terms of China's forays into the Middle East. Mr. Kitamura, what do you make of the, not necessarily the visits to China, but China's visits, say, to Saudi Arabia, and the welcome that Xi Jinping was given in Saudi Arabia is second only to like the next coming of Jesus or something, the way he was welcomed there, and the Saudis cozying up to them. This is a problem that's been going on for 3,000 years or longer in the Middle East. Does China have the wherewithal, the knowledge, the understanding to insert itself effectively? It's on.
Yeah, I'm sure, but in anyhow, Xi Jinping has already started his global strategy, One Belt, One Road initiative. Concerning the intervention toward the Middle East, I believe the motivation for the energy is so important for China. Therefore, they try to reconcile Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's a very natural policy, but at the same time, in considering actual situation, China is also a little bit disappointed at this turbulent situation in the Middle East.
Matt, the grand strategy, if you will, of the Biden administration, right, was to sort of pivot away from the Middle East. They felt as though they could leave Afghanistan, perhaps encourage the expansion of the Abraham Accords a little bit, but there was a clear pivot away in order to pivot to China. Is that something that's possible even, or are we learning that anytime the United States does pivot away from anywhere, that they get caught with their pants down, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, well, I think that's the lesson of the Hamas assault. You can want to have less to do with the Middle East, but the Middle East still wants to have a lot to do with us. And so the Abraham Accords that President Trump and his administration completed was a great inheritance, I think, for this country and for the Biden administration. I mean, and it supports the idea of economizing our forces a bit in the Middle East. If you have Sunni Arab states cooperating with Israel as a counterbalance to Iran and its terrorist proxies, that's a good strategy. The problem early in the Biden administration, and they're working to recover from these mistakes, was that President Biden alienated the Sunni Arab allies, and that was a big strategic mistake. It was unnecessary, and we're now feeling the blowback from that. Again, I'm very glad that President Biden made the trip to Israel, but he, partly due to the disinformation of terrorists claiming that Israel had bombed a hospital in Gaza, which is disinformation. It was actually Islamic Jihad, most likely. President Biden was unable to get meetings with some Arab leaders. I don't think that would have happened if he had played the first couple of years of the administration differently with his Middle East policy.
Yeah, it's pretty stunning that we give billions of dollars to the Egyptians and the Jordanians, and then they wouldn't meet with the president. Bonnie, how do you view China's move to try to capitalize on this, and how, from just a strategy perspective, how does Xi Jinping look now, 2.5 years into the Biden administration? How do they look right now at the change between Trump policies and Biden policies?
Well, first I want to raise a broad question, and then I'll get to that. And the Trump administration, of course, when it came in and wrote its national security strategy centered on great power competition, which is what our panel is about today. But there's a broader question, of course, after what's going on in the Middle East is, should we be completely turning away from terrorism as a threat? And we learned so much as a country and a military about how to fight terrorism. I think we need to keep that muscle memory working. And so I wonder, in national security strategies going forward, whether there will be some greater discussion about threats that the United States and our allies face from terrorism. I think that Xi Jinping felt in the first few years after President Trump came to power, and Matt, of course, knows this well, that he was able to work with the Trump administration. And I think this was in part because there was, at least after a few missteps at the beginning, and understanding reached that President Trump would adhere to the one China policy, which was not inevitable, but he did accept. And then when they met at Mar-a-Lago, Xi Jinping essentially agreed that he would do some work with the U.S. or in coordination with the U.S. To put pressure on North Korea and pass more resolutions in the UN Security Council and sanctions. And that the trade issue of our bilateral trade deficit would essentially be put on the shelf. And I think COVID fundamentally undermined that understanding. And President Trump, I think, sort of rightly called out what the Chinese were doing. Obviously, COVID emanated it originated in Wuhan. So the Chinese had hoped when President Biden came in that they could go back to the Obama administration. I think it took them probably over a year before they finally accepted that the Biden administration really was going to inherit its assessment of the threats that China posed. There's some difference in approaches, but I would say they built on many of the Trump administration's approaches. And so now the Chinese have come to understand we have a bipartisan consensus in the United States about the threats that China poses. And though I still think that they believe that if President Trump were to be reelected, that they could deal with him in a more transactional way. And they believe that he's not as committed to protecting Taiwan as President Biden is.
Interesting. This is a quote from 1980, The Real War. Either we act like a great power or we will be reduced to a minor power. And thus reduced, we will not survive, nor will freedom or Western values survive. Mr. Kitamura, from the perspective of our Asian allies, specifically Japan, that's now ramping up its own military forces, does Japan look at the United States as still acting like a great power?
I believe the presence of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region, is a cornerstone of the security of Japan. At the same time, the safety of the Taiwan Strait. Last year, Prime Minister Kishida prescribed the new national security strategy, which prescribed the counter-strike capability and doubling the defense expenditure. It's a very historical shift for our defense policy. I believe at the same time, the Prime Minister Kishida decided to double the defense expenditure. I think it's rather coping with his surrounding situation, because during the tenure of the Prime Minister Abe, he is from time to time criticized as hawkish politician in Japan. But during his tenure, the expenditure of the defense budget is almost 1%. Of course, he keeps a very close relationship with the President Trump. At the same time, he pays attention to his difficult neighbor. He met 27th time with President Putin in order to conclude the peace treaty. And because of the COVID-19, it was canceled. But he tried to invite Xi Jinping as the state guest to Japan. I think compared with two prime ministers, maybe Prime Minister Abe is underscore the power of the diplomacy with neighbors. And such kind of multi-layered system, expenditure of the defense and diplomacy, and multi-layered international system like Quad and free and open in the Pacific. Such kind of mobilization of the policy enhance the deterrence of Japan. But actually, the surrounding situation has changed because the Ukraine warfare started. Mr. Prime Minister Kishida aligned more closely to the United States. Therefore, in order to keep the deterrent power of Japan, it's important for us to double the military expenditure in the near future. Thank you.
John, I'll flip that on its head. As you look at the world looking at America, does it appear that we do have a grand strategy, that there is something holding a thread through all of our foreign policy moves, or is it, as Matt pointed out, much more reactionary?
I think in many ways, unfortunately, it is more reactionary. And again, alluding to the earlier panel, we really haven't had the kind of strategic thinking in the United States basically since the end of the Cold War. We still call the post-Cold War era the post-Cold War era, defining about what took place before 1991. And I would say in many ways the U.S. today, now especially in the U.S.-China competition, is looking to define this new era as one that upholds the so-called rules-based international order, which we feel is under threat possibly with any Chinese actions vis-a-vis Taiwan, obviously with the Russian invasion, or I should say re-invasion of Ukraine, and now, of course, with everything roiling in the Middle East. And I'm not faulting this administration. I think there's been a larger lack of leadership here in Washington, especially throughout our political class, and a lack of communication with the American people as to why American leadership on the world stage, I personally believe, is still fundamental to some sense of world peace, relatively speaking, and shared prosperity around the world. And even with Ukraine, I do fault the administration on this, as well as Republican supporters of this so-called winning strategy. I mean, I still have not had any serious individual explain to me how Ukraine can actually win a war against Russia. Russia is not only a nuclear superpower, it is a commodity superpower. We keep talking about the oil and gas it's selling to China and to India, but more than 100 countries around the world want nothing to do with American and Western sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. And so we're losing the global south in many ways to China and to Russia, and the Ukraine war is a catalyst for all of this. So we need to really rethink if we've made some bad decisions getting into Ukraine. And I don't know if some of you may have picked this up in the last week or so. Even the NSC spokesman, John Kirby, he spoke last week in front of the microphones and said, we're getting to the end of the rope on Ukraine. Somehow this missed most media coverage. But inside the White House, I have to believe they're looking now for ways to extricate themselves from ongoing $100 billion annual commitments to Ukraine. So on the larger question, Leland, yes, that is lacking on the grand strategy level. It doesn't mean that we can't continue to try to devise at least components of a grand strategy. And I just want to close on one thing here with these remarks, Leland, and not just because Shigeru is here on stage, but the Japan-U.S. relationship is maybe one of the most important alliances, from my perspective, for the United States, and we almost never talk about this publicly. We focus on U.S. alliances with many other countries. But if you look at the fact that we're both major democracies, economic powers, technology powers, and security powers, especially over the issue of Taiwan now, you know, I think the U.S. has the will to be as supportive of Japan in the event of a crisis around Taiwan. My longer-term grand strategy concern, Leland, is will we have the capacity to be the stalwart ally and military security provider for Japan if, for instance, now with high interest rates here in the United States, our federal debt service is about to exceed, if it hasn't already, our annual defense outlays. So what does the United States do when we're paying $1 trillion a year for debt service alone, let alone the fact that we're not able to tackle entitlements in this country? Do we have the capability to build up the defense systems we need and push the frontiers of physics and computing to deal with a massive ongoing Chinese military buildup that may upend security throughout the Western Pacific?
It's a great point in terms of the U.S. military supremacy, which is what won the Cold War and went along with the diplomatic strategy as well, because the world knew we could back it up. Matt, from a domestic political perspective, can you have a grand strategy when now both parties have this extraordinarily vocal and increasingly powerful populist wing to it?
Yeah, I mean, the moment we're in right now is a lot like the 1930s. We had a very divided country in the 30s. You had some pretty wacky ideologies that were gaining traction in the 30s. Of course, we had a depression. Things were worse in many ways, of course, in the 1930s, but we were doing our best to emulate or imitate some of the less desirable aspects of that period. It took a war to shake us out of that, and I'm really hoping that it's not going to require a direct hot war for us to get our act together politically. We need better leadership across Washington. To John's point, we're not just talking about the executive branch or one person. So the answer is yes, because we've been in a bad place before. We were able to recover from that. It's just I'd like to do that short of revolution and short of war this time. Thanks.
Yeah. Bonnie, are you seeing China understand where America is? And we've known that the Russians over time, since the 50s, were involved in trying to influence U.S. policy both overtly and covertly. Are the Chinese doing the same thing? Are we doing enough to stand up to them in order to be able to have a strategy versus them defining our strategy for us internally?
Oh, it's a great question, Leland. I think that the Chinese really do have a grand strategy to deal with the United States. They understand where American weaknesses are. They are working hard to divide us from our allies. Matt talked earlier about the disinformation that the Russians are using. We have seen more disinformation come out of China in the last few years than we saw for decades before that. And there is some collaboration between Russia and China on content farms and amplifying each other's messages, which I think is extremely dangerous, but does really indicate, I think, how closely Putin's worldview is aligned with Xi Jinping, which doesn't mean, of course, that Moscow and Beijing agree on everything, but they, in my view, very effectively compartmentalize their differences and work together where they converge in their interests. So I think that we shouldn't underestimate what the Chinese are trying to achieve. And potentially their ability to do it. Many people talk about whether we should be de-risking or decoupling from China. We should be crystal clear that it is the Chinese who really started to emphasize technological self-reliance as a driver for their strategy to achieve national rejuvenation. And that was long before the Biden administration came to power. So this is a strategy that the Chinese are going to try and work on use their relations with Russia, with the global South countries, which many of them are very supportive of China. And they are going to try and divide us from our allies and exploit our weaknesses and use opportunities where they emerge. And going back to your reference earlier to China essentially, I don't know if I'd say mediating, but enabling an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I would say was opportunistic. There aren't too many countries in the world that have good relations with both and could help the two countries that wanted to improve their relations, and so Beijing stepped up. But I don't think that Beijing is going to be, as I said earlier, the leader of mediating peace, either between Russia and Ukraine or between Palestine and Israel and Hamas.
Yeah, what China can do by itself versus what China and Russia can do together is a vastly different thing. Mr. Kitamura, there's the saying in English, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Is it too late for the United States to do what Nixon did? And I'll read the quote. "The U.S. must play a leading role on the world stage. On dozens of occasions during the Cold War, the U.S. proved that it was the only nation in the free world that consistently had extended its power far beyond its borders to blunt Soviet aggression." Is it too late for the United States to play Beijing and Moscow off each other in the way that Richard Nixon did?
From time to time, Russia and China is described as, to some extent, allies, but the relation is not always, excuse me, always good. Actually, I explain a little bit the situation. The Sino-Russian relations are generally good, but the Ukraine war has limited the scope of the relationship in several areas. For example, the Chinese banks have been reluctant to invest in Russia and suspended plans to build a railroad to Beijing. The Chinese side has stated that the Ukraine war was the cause. The Chinese fear a second round of the US sanctions. For example, concerning the pipeline plan, Power of Siberia 2, they never reached an agreement with the construction of any pipeline until now. It will start the operation in 2025, it's expected. However, it's not possible. And there is no common understanding of what to do with Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and the BRICS in the future. Regarding SCO, China wants to make it a counterbalance to the US. On the other hand, Russia wants to use it not only as a counterbalance, but also as a concrete regional security entity. Russia has shown a supporting posture for India. India also opposed China's push for the yuan to become the reserve currency within the BRICS. Russia is frustrated by China's slow support to Russia over Ukraine warfare. Russia's current position concerning ceasefire of Ukraine is ceasefire is impossible without China's involvement. On the other hand, China is willing to consider mediation if Russia becomes more flexible. But there are no signs that Putin is showing any flexibility.
I want to get Matt in on this. Real quick, Matt. One thing that we've seen with the United States has, at least they feel they've been effective in doing, is being able to stop Chinese arms shipments, lethal arms shipments into Russia. How does that play into what Mr. Kitamura was saying?
Well, you'll remember shortly after the Russian failed assault on Kiev in February of 2022, President Biden had a video call with Xi Jinping. And according to President Biden's own account of that call, he told Xi Jinping, you need the US economy a lot more than you need the Russian economy, so do not provide weapons to Russia. And I think that he drew a red line. I think that red line has played an important role, but it's also clear that Beijing's trying to tread or skirt that red line, or at least around the edges. A lot of the things that matter most to Russia's military response are components, chips and drones and things that are dual use and not strictly military. And that's ended up being very important for the Russian campaign. So President Biden, I think he may very soon be tested on the red line that he drew. I wanted to add, agreeing with Kitamura-san, and wanted to add one other point to your question to him. This was an uneasy marriage between Russia and China. Nonetheless, it is a marriage now. This is what Putin and Xi Jinping both call a no-limits pact, right? I think we want to set the conditions for the divorce when it eventually comes. And it's going to be a nasty divorce, especially for Russia. And Xi Jinping's not going to be paying child support anymore when that happens. I don't think that divorce will occur until one of the two men dies. They both intend to stay in power till death. But once one of them does die, a lot of the natural problems in that relationship will start to express themselves more. I just want to mention one of them. China claims more Russian territory on its maps and in its internal statements than it claims territory of its other neighbors. And it just fought a bloody skirmish, a couple of years ago with India over that. They claim Vladivostok, and on their more and more of China's maps, they use Chinese city names for Russian cities. So it gives you an idea of what's to come in that relationship.
John, something that I think is interesting that's happened domestically in America is the rise of China hawks, even sort of among the American population. We've seen and we've reported on towns that have now revolted against Chinese battery factories, against Chinese agriculture purchases. Arkansas just kicked a Chinese company out. What do the Chinese make of this sort of rise of an anti-Chinese feeling in America?
Well, I personally would not describe it as an anti-Chinese sentiment. I think that there's a greater awareness in the United States and among the American people that the Chinese Communist Party represents an extraordinary threat to the well-being of the United States and to the international order as we know it. But specifically, the fact that the Chinese Communist Party has infiltrated every entity that is looking to invest in the United States, to take advantage of our open economy and our open society and our generally free media. But look at the fact that we had this situation in North Dakota, where there was a Chinese entity that was looking to acquire property that happens to be near a U.S. Air Force base. The Chinese companies own, I believe, about half of America's meat processing facilities. When you put this into context of a very difficult relationship, and probably one that I think is going to become more difficult in the years to come, Bonnie alluded to the technology competition that's taking place now between the U.S. and China. I think we're realizing more and more that we're dealing with a very different China than we thought was the case in 2001, when the United States welcomed China, even though it wasn't prepared yet for World Trade Organization membership. We brought it in on an expedited basis, hoping that it would become a quote-unquote responsible stakeholder, a freer, more consensual government, so that as its citizens became wealthier, they would demand more political freedom and the CCP would liberalize. And kind of the way Hamas fed false information and intelligence to the Israelis in recent years, we've lulled ourselves into believing that we had a responsible partner in the CCP. I want to pull this in a sort of a larger direction too, Leland. I see that our time is running short. Going back to the issue before that we were discussing about whether we're a reactionary country when it comes to grand strategy, let me offer two thoughts here, if I might. One is, I think the original strategy that we had during the Cold War was a relatively sound one, and that is that the U.S. sought to ensure there was no regional hegemon that would dominate Asia, no regional hegemon that would dominate Europe, so that we avoid the cataclysmic events of World War II, and certainly no regional hegemon in the Middle East, so that we had a balance of power. And the U.S., of course, was supporting those countries that were looking to resist hegemonic activities. Going forward, I reflect on the statement that Xi Jinping made to Vladimir Putin in March of this year when he left Moscow. And I don't remember the exact quote, so forgive me. But with all the cameras there to record this, Xi Jinping said to Vladimir Putin, "My dear friend, you and I are witnessing changes the likes of which we have not seen in 100 years, since the end of World War I. And our two countries are the drivers of these changes." And Putin said simply, "I agree." And I think the challenge for the United States is to prove them wrong, that they're not the drivers of change on the world stage, that it will continue to be the United States working with our allies in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Latin America to try to right what's been wrong over the last several years or last several decades. And maybe that becomes the foundation for whatever this next grand strategy begins to look like, Leland.
All right. I'm going to give Bonnie the last word, and I appreciate what you said in terms of an anti-Chinese sentiment versus a realization of the threat from China.
Chinese Communist Party.
Much better stated than I did. Bonnie, I'll give you the last word, but I think what's interesting and to tie this all together is that during the Cold War that Richard Nixon helped to win, America was united both in terms of its businesses and in terms of its population and in terms of its politicians against this one threat. Are you seeing that happen as it relates to China now?
Well, I'll start, since it's appropriate, to quote Richard Nixon, that in his Foreign Affairs article in 1967, he said, "The West has abandoned its colonial role. It no longer threatens the independence of the Asian nations. Red China, however, does, and its threat is clear, present, and repeatedly and insistently expressed." And although I don't think everybody in the United States agrees with that today, there is certainly growing recognition of the challenges that Beijing poses. Our public opinion polls show somewhere around 82 to 85% of Americans see China in a negative way. And a very large percentage sees China as posing the greatest threat to the United States and to our allies. But they obviously we have a business community that I think is still to some extent divided, although the direction of that is also clear, where there are more and more businesses that are thinking more longer term and not short term. I do a lot of work with Europeans and with German businesses, and I can say they're still lagging behind. They are making a lot of money in China. So we have to do more work, I think, as a country to ensure that we and our allies are on the same page. Because another point that Richard Nixon made was that, in the same article, for the United States to go it alone in containing China would not only place an unconscionable burden on our own country, but would also heighten the chances of nuclear war while undercutting the independent development of the nations of Asia. So we can debate whether or not we should be containing China, but I certainly think we need to be working more closely with our allies to protect and defend our shared interests.
And we end on a quote from President Nixon. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the panel. We really appreciate it. Some excellent points by all of you. And I guess the next panel begins, I think, in about 5 or 10 minutes, so we'll take a quick break. Thank you all.